On first glance, it seems from this gospel that none of us are safe from Jesus' judgment. Okay, so you haven't committed murder, he says, but if you've been angry, it's just as bad. Is there anyone here who has not once been angry in their life? As for committing adultery, he says, simply looking at another woman with lust is basically the same thing. It seems that only gay men and straight women are off the hook on this one. And maybe not even them. And sexual unfaithfulness is the only valid reason for divorce, Jesus teaches us. And by the way, marrying a divorced woman is the same as committing adultery. I'm not going to name any names, but I know a few of us are in trouble here this morning. So we have a choice. We can read these literally and pluck out our eyes and cut off our hands in the name of faithfulness, or we can pull back and see the intent of what Jesus was saying. You have heard it said, "You shall not murder." But I say to you, this is really about anger. I don't think Jesus was saying that being angry is the same thing as murdering someone. I do think he's making a point about where anger left unchecked leads. Anger, which leads to judgment, which leads to insult, is what leads to the dangerous stuff. So, Jesus calls us to make peace before it gets out of hand, to reconcile with our siblings before we come to this table or any table together. In fact, that's the reason why we pass the peace before communion, to reconcile with one another. You have heard it said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, men, you need to stop making sex objects of women. When it comes to adultery, Jesus shifts the focus. Typically in a patriarchal society, it's the woman who is more severely judged for unfaithfulness than the man. It was true in Jesus' time, and it is still true today. But what Jesus is saying is, it's on men to recognize and shift how they view and treat women. You have heard it said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you, that mostly leaves women in the lurch. Divorce has generally always favored men. And that was definitely the case in Jesus' time. Because generally women were dependent, completely dependent on men for their survival. They couldn't make a living on their own. That's just not how the world was structured in that time. So when a man asked for a divorce, and only a man was able to formally initiate a divorce, not women, he would probably be fine. But not only would the woman generally bear the brunt of shame and blame for the end of the marriage, she'd also have a hard time surviving on her own. That was broadly true in our own country up until very recently. It wasn't until the 1960s that all women in the United States were allowed to open their own bank account. And this dependency on men is still true for a lot of women today. So when Jesus says that divorce should not be so easily given, it's not that far-fetched to think that he's trying to protect women. You have heard it said. This is Jesus' way of saying, you think you know the right and proper way things should be. But then he says, But I say to you, which is his way of saying, is your vision for the world so small? You cling to certainty, Jesus says, but I'm here to make cracks in all you think you're sure about. Jack's sure of something. I have a master's degree in all this Christian stuff. It's a Master of Divinity. It's really strange that's a strange degree. Anyway, I have taken multiple Bible courses, diving deep into different parts of the scripture. I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian church where I memorized scriptures like it was my job. And after all of that, I can only come to two certain conclusions from our Bible. First, God is love. But that springs from the second. And you've heard me say it before. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. On those two commandments hang all the law and all the prophets. Jesus' lens for interpreting his entire faith? Love, which is what he teaches his disciples and us, which is what leads me to have absolute certainty that God is love. Oh, and we think we know what love is. I think I know what love is. You have heard it said that love is this warm and squishy feeling that makes us happy all the time. But Jesus says to us, sometimes love isn't that simple. Most of you have probably heard me talk about my time as a chaplain on the streets in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. It's a rough neighborhood. I would say that at least 70% of the people I talked to had a mental health issue, a pretty serious one, for which there was no accessible options for them to get good treatment. So a lot of them self-medicated with alcohol, with marijuana, with meth, which obviously compounded their issues. I tended mostly to unhoused folks, but I also regularly met with a few people who lived in SROs, single room occupancies. It's a step above shelters, long-term housing in a dorm for very low-income people. Richard lived in an SRO, but he had been unhoused for many years because of his untreated schizophrenia. Now, he was keeping up with his medication and regularly seeing his support people. He was on a bus for hours every single day just to get all the services and medication he needed, which were all over the city. It was a full-time job. I was one of his support people. We had communion together every week. He consecrated it. It was a little bit loosey-goosey liturgically. What I quickly discovered about Richard was that he took the Bible literally. And he had a large amount of it memorized. He was very often disappointed with me when I didn't know what scripture he was citing, what book it came from. He railed against adultery, people who did drugs, and anyone who committed blasphemy against the Spirit, which in his opinion was a lot of people. I don't even know what that means. I'm sure you can guess what I did. I tried to convince him that the Bible wasn't literal. that it was in fact impossible for it to be literal. I thought I was being loving, teaching him a more expansive way of looking at his faith. But whenever I did that, he would get really confused and agitated. He didn't get mad at me. He just couldn't fit what I was saying into his worldview. What I was saying was so destabilizing for him. It took me longer than it should have, but I finally started to realize some things. First, Richard's schizophrenic mind needed black and white rules to follow. His life depended on the Bible being a straight and narrow guide. It gave his mind a point of reference. It gave his heart peace. And who the heck was I to tell him otherwise? Just because he found peace differently than I did didn't mean that his peace wasn't real. And it was. I could see it. He was a soft and kind soul. Despite his biblical literalism, he treated me, a woman, like his pastor. And at my going away party when that job ended, he was delighted to meet my female partner. I was so certain about what God's expansive love looked like that I couldn't see how God's expansive love was already at work in Richard's life. I'm not saying we shouldn't speak out if a particular way of believing is harming people, the way that certain approaches to Christianity harm queer folks, women, people in poverty, and so on. Jesus constantly spoke out against how some religious people put religious rules above healing, above love. What I am saying is that Jesus also had a knack for turning our certainty on its head. You have heard it was said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Your imagination held tight by what is. But I say to you, a better way there may be. Sight isn't vision. What's comfortable can be a sham. How things are excludes too much. For if you let what is be all, where do you see the kingdom's changing call?